I've been getting quite a few requests to do a scoring video, and I've been a scorer for 37 years, and I will show you my documentation for those that might question it. But anyway, I'm going to do not only a scoring video to show how to physically score a deer with a tape measure and cables and you know, and then writing it down, writing each tine and beam length down and deductions and stuff like that. But I'm also going to discuss and show a lot of pictures and go upstairs and look at some deer on the wall. I've got most of my deer heads. I think I got 60 some deer heads at a sporting goods store. I brought 3 of my smaller ones. You know, these are kind of small ones home. And plus I've got 5 of my better ones upstairs hanging up on the wall. I'm not going to take them down, but I'm going to get a ladder and show those to you and show why they score high or why they don't score high or why they score high but they have deductions on them because one of them has a pretty big abnormal point. But anyway, I brought some small stuff home. Easier to score. Bigger ones are more difficult, especially when they're on the mount. And then we're going to talk about also scoring deer in the field. You know, you're sitting in a tree, you got a buck coming in. How do you get a quick gross or net score? I've been doing that for years. When you've done it a lot and you're a scorer, obviously it's relatively simple. But I get asked about that all the time. You know, a lot of times you'll have a wider buck come in. Wide antler bucks, it's pretty common for wider antler bucks to have short tines. And a lot of times narrower racked bucks, 16, 17, 18 inches, they got 10, 12 inch tines, whereas something that's 22, 23 inch inside spread, it's got, you know, 6, 7 inch tines. Well, the inside spread is one measurement. When you got tines and you got 8 tines, you know, making it a 10 point, including the main beam, you got multiple tines. So if you got something and it's got, you know, 2 or 3 inch longer tines on each tine, that adds up fast. So having something, the taller tines is what adds your score up. The inside spread, again, that's just one measurement. So, you know, it's really easy to get fooled in the field, and also out of symmetry stuff. You may see something come in and it's got a tall G2 on the right and a short G2 on the left, and it's got a tall G3 on the left and a short G3 on the right. Well, your gross score for that's going to be okay, but because both of those sides are out of symmetry with each other, they're going to get a lot of deductions. So your net score is going to be considerably less. So I'm going to kind of go through that so you can get a quick idea of how to roughly score a deer and know what to look for on a deer that's going to score higher that could potentially make the book. For this video, I just want to verify that I am an official scorer. I started scoring in 1984, so I've been scoring for 37 years, which is quite a while. And just so happens, I found, when I was looking through my old paperwork, I found this wallet verification that certifies that I am, and it was signed by Mitch Rumpala, who at the time was the scoring chairman for Michigan record books. So I just wanted to show that as verification that I am a scorer. And this is an official score sheet. We also have green score sheets for just green scoring, so people can get a rough idea what their deer is going to score before it's ran through its 60-day drying period, because when an animal's shot, it has to run through a 60-day drying period before it can be legally scored and entered into a record book. But anyway, it's pretty simple. You've got a length of right main beam, length of left main beam, inside spread right here, which ends up going right here. That's your inside spread, not outside spread. A lot of people think your outside spread is your width, and that is not the case. It's the widest spot between your main beams on the inside, not the outside. Then you have the length of all your normal points, which is going to be, you know, on a 8 point, you're basically going to have a brow tine, which is going to be your G1, then you're going to have your next points G2, the next point's a G3. 10 point, you're going to also have a G4, 12 point, you're going to have a G5. But anyway, you have a right beam, all the normal points on the right, and then all the normal points on the left. And then there's a difference column. So if you have let's say your G2, your second point on your right side is 7 inches and your second point on your left side is 6 1/8 of an inch, you're going to have a 7/8 of an inch difference, because whether you're scoring non-typical or typical, you still score the typical frame of the deer. So, and those are going to be typical points. So if there's a 7/8 of an inch difference, it's going to go down here in this difference column, and those are going to be totaled, and that's going to be a deduction from your score. So all the length of your points and your circumferences and your beams are going to go into your gross score, which is going to be definitely higher. That's going to be your highest score. A lot of times that's what people tell people their score of their deer is their gross. But to put a buck in the record book, like Pope and Young's 125 inches, it has to be 125 inches net. So that's after all of the deductions. And then you also have an area here for abnormal points, right beam, left beam, any abnormal points. So if you got a G2 on your left side, you know, the second tine up, or if your brow tine has a kicker off the base, or you got a fork on a G2 or a G3, those are abnormal points. If you kill like a 9-pointer, so you've got a typical 8 and then you've got another tine on the end of the beam, you know, towards the end of the beam, like it's, you know, it would be a 10-point if it had the same thing on the other side. That is not an abnormal point. That is a typical point. So that gets added on, and then it just gets deducted back off as if it did not exist. An abnormal point is something that's added on to your gross, but it gets taken off your total. So it's a little bit different. And then everything gets totaled, and everything goes by the 1/8 of an inch. You know, turkeys are 1/16. Any animals, you know, deer, elk, muleys, they all go by the 1/8 of an inch. So this is going to be, if I don't know how well you can read that, but that's how you score deer, and I'm actually going to do one. I'm going to do a couple actually. So let's get started. These are the items you need for scoring a deer. Now this is an actual scoring tape. It's got a blunt end on one side. That's what you put at the base of the burr, and then you tape it up the main beam, or you put it at the base of the tine and measure it up the tine. And then the alligator clip is basically what you will, wherever the end of the tine is or the main beam, you clip it to the cable, and then that's where your length. You can make your own. These two here were archery cables back in the old bow days when bows had cables as opposed to strings. So I just have some old archery cables here, and then I just bought an alligator clip to market. And then I like to have, this is a little Stanley 3-foot. This is a stiffer tape. It's relatively stiff for measuring the cables. And then for measuring circumferences, because this is a soft tape, you can wrap it around and measure stuff really easy. It's not rigid, it's soft. And then obviously you need a pencil to mark the tines, where the tine intersects the top edge of the main beam, the top plane of the main beam, so you can measure from the tip of the tine down to the top edge of the main beam. You mark that with a pencil, and then I write everything on an ink pen as far as the score sheet itself. I decided to score this 10-point instead of that 8-point I had laying on the table, just because of the circumferences and some other reasons. But anyway, my wife's asleep, so I have to kind of be a little bit quiet, but I'll be loud enough for everybody to hear. This is a 150-ish 10-point. I shot this in 2014, opening morning on a 2-acre parcel. Just happened to be owned by an old lady. She actually lived there. And but she never went out back, and she had 2 acres that butted up to a huge cattail swamp, and a lot of deer bedded on it, and this deer was traveling its edge. So a lot of times the size of the parcel doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. You know, I'll take 2 acres of bedding area, prime bedding area, or prime bedding area edges over 400 acres of just big open timber with no understory any day of the week, because big bucks definitely gravitate to security cover. But anyway, this is, again, 150-ish 10-point, and I've got the cables already on here. I've actually scored this deer. Obviously, I have the score because it's in the record book. But I left a couple of the cables on here just to show how that's done. And then I'm going to kind of go through the measuring process where you can hopefully see it and my back's not in your way. And let's get started. So I have this cable here. You enter, because what you do is you measure both main beams, you measure all the points, all the typical points, and you measure the inside spread, and then you get 4 circumferences. You get a circumference between the brow and the burr, between the brow and the G2, and between the G2 and the G3, and on a 10 point between the G3 and the G4. Now if this were an 8 point, or a 6 point, let's say it's an 8 point because that's real common. What you would do, because this G4 would not be here, is you would measure from the center of this tine down the main beam to the end, and then you'd split that measurement in half and make a mark on the beam, and then that's where you would get your 4th circumference. Now if it were a 6 point, you'd do the same thing. So you'd have a brow and a G2, and then the end of the main beam. You'd measure from the center of that G2 to the end of the main beam, split the difference, and that would be your C3 and your C4. So you'd get 2 circumferences. They'd both be the same for your C3 and C4. And this is 10 points are kind of common. I've killed 26 10 points. I've probably killed 48 points. Probably a dozen 9 points, and I don't know, several 11s, 2 12s, and a 14. But 10 points are kind of interesting because 10 points obviously they carry more circumferences because you're going to get a bigger circumference on your C4 because it's between 2 tines. Whereas on an 8 point, when you get to your C4, it's going to be halfway down the beam to the end. So it's going to, because as a beam comes down, it gets smaller in diameter. So your C4s are going to be considerably smaller on an 8 point than on a 10 point. And also with a 10 point, you obviously get a G4 to measure where you don't get a G4. You get 2 of them actually on a 10, whereas you don't get that with an 8. Now if this were a 9 point, it would have 1 G4. If it was a typical 9 point, it would have 1 G4. And it wouldn't have a G4 on the corresponding side, on the symmetrical other side. So basically this would get that 9th point, which would be your G4 on one side, would get added onto your gross. It goes into the gross column, but it's going to get totally deducted out because it does not have a symmetrical point on the opposite side. So everything goes off symmetry. If one brow tine's an inch longer than the other, so let's say one's 5 and one's 6, so you get 11 inches, but you're going to get an inch deducted because it's an inch out of symmetry from one side to the other. That's the same on all your tines. So anytime you have a 9th point or you got a typical 11 point, that 11th point is going to be totally deducted even though it's added onto the gross. It's not going to count on the net. So on these cables, I've already done the measurement. And this one here, which is the right main beam, I already took the cable off, measured it, put it back on, was 23 and 0 inches. So on the tines, what I typically will do, if you see these little marks, I actually have a cable on that mark, and I got it running up here, and I put a clip on the end, so that's the length of that tine. I did the same thing on the main beam. I ran the cable along the center plane of the actual beam all the way from the burr to the end, and then I put a clip on it because these scoring cables come with clips on the end. This here is an old archery cable and I bought a clip for it. So I measured these already, but I'll kind of do it so you can see. And this is the right beam, and what did I have this at? Right beam. Okay, my brow was 7.4. My G2 was 9.1 to that little mark right there, pencil mark. And then the G3 was 8.3. And then the G4 basically what I'm doing is I'm putting this tape on the tip of the tine and measuring it down to that pencil mark. Was 4.4, 4.5 inches. And then I did the same thing on here. This was a little over 8 inches because this has a curve to it. They're kind of the same height, but this curves up. Anytime a tine has a curve to it, you're following the outside edge. So because it curves at the top, it's going to be longer. And then you did this. I did the same thing here. I did the same thing here, and I did the same thing on the G4. And then I also measured the inside spread, which was 16 inches. Now this actually is 16 inches now. It probably shrunk 1/8 or quarter of an inch, you know, as it dried. And then on the circumferences, and again, I've already done this. What you do with the circumferences, and I use a soft tape for this, very soft, just a cloth tape. Your circumferences, you do the first one between your brow and your burr, and you do it at the narrowest point, at the smallest diameter point. And that one was 4 6/8. That was almost 5 inches. You do your second C2 between the brow and the G2, and that one was 3 7/8. Do your next one between your G2 and your G3, and that looks like it was 3 7/8 again, or 3 7/8, and this one here was 3 6/8. So that C4 being 3 6/8, it's basically 1/8 of an inch smaller than the C3. If that had been an 8-point, where you're down here, where this tine's not here, that probably would have been probably at least an inch smaller in circumference. So that's a big advantage on a 10-point. You get to score 2 G4s, and plus your circumferences between your G3 and G4 are going to be a lot bigger than between your G3 and the end of the main beam on an 8-point. And again, I've already done this. Trying to think if there's anything else I needed to talk about here. Obviously, this is a 10-point because it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This is pretty basic stuff, but some people may wonder. I think that's all that I had. So anyway, that's how you score. I hope everybody understood that. It's relatively simple. Now on a non-typical, I probably should explain this. Let's say you have a kicker here, or let's say you have a forked G2, so you got another tine coming off here. Let's say you got, a lot of times it's really common to have a little, kind of stuff like this. See that low point right there? It's pretty common to have little stickers down here by your burr, or a sticker coming off your brow, or a forked brow, or a forked G2. Those are all abnormal points. So a typical point is something that's coming off of the top plane of the main beam. Those are typical points. Anything coming off the side or the inside or off another tine, those are abnormal points. And abnormal points, they do not get added onto your gross. Those go in an abnormal point column. So if you had a buck that ended up let's say it scored 154 gross, which is the total of everything without deductions, and let's say you had 4 inches of deductions, which would bring it down to 150 inches, and then let's say you had 6 inches of non-typical abnormal points, that would bring you down to 144. And the difference is, you know, like those are total deduction points, so they don't get added onto your gross. So it's not like you had 154 of typical points and then you added your 6 inches of abnormal points on to give you 160, and then you take them off down to 154. That's not the way it works. Abnormal points go in a total deduction column, and there's solid deductions off your net score. So if you got 12.5 inches or more of abnormal points, then they get added onto your net score of your typical rack, and then basically then it goes into a non-typical category. And a non-typical category for P and Y is 150-inch buck. For a typical, it's 125 inches. So that's why it's 12 5/8. You double the 12.5 inches. Anything 12.5 or smaller is a deduction. 12.5 or bigger. 12.5 times 2 is 25. So that's why it's 125 for typical, 150 for non-typical. And there's 12.5 is the break line for deductions being deducted off typical or added as non-typical. And again, an abnormal point is an abnormal point. If this were a 9 point, this would be a typical point. Let's say it had a 5 and a 4. So it's a little bit different on a typical, because on a typical rack, your 9th point or your 11th pointer on a typical 11 point, they're going to get added on, but they're going to get taken off because they don't have a symmetrical corresponding point. So it's almost like they didn't even exist in the first place. It's kind of sad. And most people, when they tell somebody their score of their deer, they tell them the gross. Because the gross is more impressive. That's basically all your bone. They added together. That's prior to any deductions whatsoever. So your gross score is going to be a lot higher than your net, typically, because a buck like this doesn't have a lot of deductions. It's relatively clean, but that's kind of uncommon. Most bucks will have 3 to 6, 7, 8 inches of deductions. So obviously it sounds better when you tell them a gross score as opposed to a net score. And that's fine, because this is just record book talk. I'm talking. Doesn't really mean anything, I think, to a lot of hunters, and it just happens to mean something to me because that's where I'm at on the skill set side. But I'm not an APR guy. I don't like pushing my agenda on everybody else, just like I don't like the government pushing their damn agenda on me. So I think it's hypocritical for people to want everybody else to conform to what they want, because they don't like to conform to what everybody else in the government wants. So that's hypocrisy 101 in my view. You shouldn't have to have a gazillion big bucks in the area to kill one. If you hunt a lot and you learn how to hunt correctly, you can kill one once in a while, and that's the way it should be. That's what hunting is. That's why it's called hunting, not just killing. Anyway, now I'm going to show you the score sheet. This is the score sheet for that 10 point, and this is pretty standard as a score sheet. That just happens to be Michigan's, but they're pretty standard. Michigan does the same scoring system as Pope and Young, and everything goes by 1/8 of an inch. So turkeys score by the 1/16 of an inch, but whitetails, elk, mule deer, blacktails, everything's to the 1/8 of an inch, nearest 1/8 of an inch. And another thing to keep in mind, I didn't mention it when I was actually scoring that buck. A lot of people measure the outside spread and they assume that means something. The outside spread doesn't mean anything. The inside spread is what counts for a buck to go in a record book. So anytime you're scoring a deer or somebody tells you the score, ask them, well, was that an inside spread? Because a lot of people say, well, I shot a 20-inch spread buck. And I always ask, well, is that inside or outside? And quite frequently they say it's the outside. So outside spread is typically going to be 2.5 to 3 inches bigger than the inside spread, because you basically got the width of 2 main beams added for the outside spread. So inside spread is the only thing that counts for record book. Also, abnormal points. This here is something, you can see it right here. Abnormal points, as you can see, there is no column here on column A, which is addition. Basically, this is going to be your total bone. That does not even count on your gross. It goes right over into a deduction column B. Column B is a deduction column. Everything here is going to get deducted, and basically column B is going to be abnormal points or out of symmetry tines. And also this pointer is kind of cool. I don't know how many of you guys have ever seen one of these, but when I was out west hunting in Kansas, locust trees are relatively common. They're common in, you know, anywhere really, Illinois, Iowa, Kansas. Michigan has some, but not quite to this extent. And I ended up killing a big, huge 9-point, 156-inch 9-point with a 6.5-inch tine coming out of its forehead right down by the bottom of the left beam. And I had to prep this tree with a hatchet, and I cut off well over 100 of these things getting up to my 28-foot height. And man, oh man, I'll tell you what, other than prepping a tree that's coated in poison ivy, this is by far the worst. And a hatchet works a lot better than a saw for knocking these things off, because these things come in clusters. There'll be a cluster of like 10 of these things coming out at one spot. And these things are long and they are sharp. And when you get them in, if you poke them in yourself, you get festered. You get a little small infection. So this was I kept this for a reason. So anyway, on that buck, the length of the right beam was 23 inches, even. You see everything's in eighth. Left beam was 21.7. Inside spread was 16 1/8 of an inch, which I brought over to here. Now there's also something here, it says length of longest main beam. So the 23-inch was my longest beam. I put that down there. And then it says enter smaller of A or B. So you always, if you got a main beam that is actually shorter than your inside spread, that will get entered as your inside spread. But that's very, very rare to have a main beam that's shorter than your inside spread. So it's something that's there for documentation. I think one time in all the deer I've scored, I had a main beam that was shorter than the inside spread, where I had to actually enter it over here in the, I actually entered the shortest beam as opposed to the inside spread. But anyway, on this case, that's the inside spread, 16.1. And then on tines, I had 7 on the right beam. I had 7.4 as a brow, 9.1 for G2, 8.3 for a G3, 4.4 for a G4. Left beam, I had 8.4 for a brow, 9.1, same as the other one. 8.2 as a G3, 4.3 as a G4. And if you notice, there is a difference column right here. There's a difference column. So on the brows, one was, I got that wrong. One was 1 inch difference than the other. One was 7.4, and the other one, I think that was supposed to be 8.2 actually, so it was 6/8. So there was 6/8 difference on the brows. The G2s were both the same, so there's 0/8. There was 1/8 of a difference on the G3s, so I put 1/8 there. And there was 1/8 of a difference on the G4s. So that gets added over here. So there's 1 inch deductions out of symmetry, and I put that over here in column B, because column B are going to be deductions out of symmetry. So I had 29 4/8 inches of tines on the right, 30 inches 2/8 on the left. There were no abnormal points. So then I came down to circumferences, and I had 4.6, 3.7, 3.7, and 3.6 on the right beam, 4.5, 3.7, 3.7, 3.5 on the left beam. So I had 1/8 of an inch difference on the C1s and 1/8 of an inch difference on the C circumference 4s. So I brought that over here into the difference column, 2/8 of an inch, and then I brought that over here into column B for the deductions. So in total, there was 153 inches of bone. That's everything added together. That's prior to any deduction. So that would be the gross on that buck, gross score. But there was 2 and 3 inches of of non-typicalness, basically, where, you know, one tine was, one G2 was shorter than the other G2. So there's 2 3/8 inches of differences that have to be deducted. So then that goes underneath the 153 gross, and then that gets deducted. So the 150 5/8 is my net. And again, I just scored this. It may be a little bit different than what's in the record book, but that's what I just scored it. It's I don't know if that's exactly right, but 150 5/8 is the net score. And again, 125 to get in P&Y for a typical, 150 for a non-typical. And I don't think there's really anything else there. But keep in mind, inside spread's what counts. Abnormal points are solid deductions unless you have over 12.5 inches. They do not get added into your total bone and then deducted out like they don't exist. They are just solid deductions off the end, off your gross. And I think that that's about it.
Something I forgot to mention on the scoreable points is, unlike what some people think, you know, your guys, well, I can put a ring on it and it stays, so that's a point. No, that is not a point. A point has to be an inch long minimum. So it has to be a minimum of 1 inch long to be a scoreable point. And another thing is, for a point to be scoreable, again, you have to make a line across where the top of the main beam would be, an imaginary line, if that point did not exist. So if you had a point that starts back here and it comes up pretty far, and then it's an inch long from here to here, from the top of the plane of the main beam to the tip of the point, it's an inch or an inch and an eighth. But where this actually starts to ride up to make that point, and then it comes back down at a curve and comes back to the beam, if the width of that base of that point is actually longer than the actual point itself, that is not a scoreable point. That would be considered like a spur. So the point, the length of the point has to exceed the width of the base of that point. So fallacy about rings and stuff like that, you know, it's got to be an inch. And like this here, this is probably an 1.5 inch long point. And obviously it's far taller than the width of the base. The width of the base is maybe 5/8 of an inch right there. I hope that helped.
Okay, this here is a small 10 point. I don't even remember what it scored, but it's around 100 inches. This doesn't make book or anything. This is one I shot back in the 70s. And anyway, this here, these points on this side, these are all typical points. Everything comes off the top plane of the main beam. So this is a typical 5-point side. While this one over here, it has 5 points, has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is an abnormal point. So this point here is going to end up getting scored and added onto the gross, because this here is your actual tine. This is a kicker off of that tine. This one is going to get scored and it's going to get added onto your gross, but it's going to get totally deducted off your net. So it's going to get added on and then deducted right off as a total deduction. This point here, because this is a G1, 2, 3, 4, and this side here only has a G1, 2, and 3, this is not a G. This here is just an abnormal point. So you got a brow, G1, G2. This is a brow, G1, G2, G3. So this side has a G3. This side over here does not. So this is going to get added onto your gross, and it's going to get deducted off as well. So it'll be like this point didn't even exist. So while this buck, it might score, yeah, I don't know, looks like it'd probably score 104 or 5 inches maybe. Gross, it's probably going to net under, you know, 95 inches, low 90s. So this here, when you're looking at a rack, you know, if it has stickers coming off, those are going to end up being deductions because those are abnormal points. Now, if you got over 12.5 inches of abnormal points, let's say you got forked brow tines or you got 2 forks up here and they're relatively long, if you got over 12.5 inches, then your buck will end up going into the non-typical category, which is a whole nother animal. Because then those become additions onto your net score, not deductions. So anytime you score any rack, whether it's non-typical or typical, you always score the typical frame, which is this stuff, anything coming off the top plane of the main beam, as well as over here. You always score the typical portion of the frame first. So again, this one here's this would be a 5x4 basically. So this is going to get deducted off, whether this is a non-typical, whether it had a bunch of junk on it or not. This is tine is going to get deducted off because it's not a tip. It doesn't have another symmetrical point on the opposite side, if that makes sense to you. So when you're looking at antlers, what you really want to try and get is bucks as typical as possible where they're symmetrical on each side. Now this also wouldn't be able to be scored no matter how big it is, because if you can see right there, I can wiggle that. That means the skull cap is cracked. And anytime a skull cap is cracked, it will not be able to be entered into the record book. I think this fell off a wall at some point over the years and broke the skull plate. Here's another example of a small, typical, I don't know, maybe 100-inch deer. And this is a relatively typical 8-point, except it has one non-typical point. This is an abnormal point because it's not coming off the top plane of the main beam like all these others. They're coming right off the top plane of the main beam, making them typical points. So this is a kicker. So this will get added on as an abnormal point to your gross, but it's going to get deducted back off. That's going to be a deduction, net deduction. This is a good example. I found this out in the woods years and years ago. Typical Michigan 2.5-year-old buck. And this, I thought I'd show this because it's a good example. You've got on your left side, the side towards me, you've got a relatively long G2. So this is your brow, which is a G1. This is your G2. But if you notice, it's got a relatively short opposite G2. And the same exact thing goes on with the G3. You've got a much longer G3 here than you do a G3 here. So if this is, let's say, 6 inches and that's 4, you're going to get 10 inches of point because it's 6 and 4, but you're going to get a 2-inch deduction because this one's 2 inches shorter than that. So it's 2 inches out of symmetry. So you're only going to get 8 inches onto your net as opposed to 10 onto your gross. Same deal here. Let's say this one's 3.5 inches and this one here is 1.5 inches. You're going to get 5 inches total, 3.5 and 1.5 inches, but you're going to get 2 inches taken off because this one's 2 inches longer than this. So whenever you're looking at a rack, if you see one side that's totally out of symmetry with another, as far as tine lengths, that's going to be some huge deductions on your net score. The ideal scenario is to, you know, for a buck to have the same similar length G2s as G3s, as brow tines, and main beams as well. This is one I shot, again, quite a few years ago. And this one's quite unique. This score is pretty high because it, as narrow as this is, I think it's like 13 inches, if that. I don't really remember. But this scored like 120 some inches. And it's got long brow tines, and they're relatively the same length. It's got, for as small a frame as this is, look at the main beams. The main beams come way around and almost touch in the front. So it's got relatively long beams for how small of a rack it is. And unlike spread, which is one measurement, on beams, you get 2 measurements. You got each beam. If this, you know, a typical rack's going to stop here maybe, so you got 3 extra inches on each side. That's 6 inches. So if you take 13 inches plus 6, that ends up being like a 19-inch inside spread with shorter beams. So anytime you see a buck that's got beams that come around and almost touching the front, you're going to get a lot more score off the main beam length. And also, if you notice, this thing has really tall G2s and G3s. So this buck, as small a frame as this scores very, very well. So because it's high, it's got really tall tines, even the brows. For as small of a rack and as young a buck this is, it's got relatively tall brows, and the beams are awesome. This would have been a hell of a deer in a couple years, but coming off public land, I'm sure somebody would have shot it with a gun. And this was I think this was a 2-year-old, if I'm not mistaken. This is a good example of a relatively wide young buck. I think it was 18 and a half inch wide. But it's got, you know, wide racks typically have short points. So this here has relatively small points. I don't even think this scored 100 inches. So this didn't make any books or anything. But it's just an example of, a lot of times wide bucks, see how the beams come out and they just stop. So you don't get a lot of beam length. And again, this is one measurement. Whereas if you get something that's 2 inches or 3 inches narrower with taller tines, you've got multiple tines with extra inches on each one. That's going to add up a lot faster than just one width. And now what I'm going to show you, I'm just going to show you some pictures because I got 8x10s of most of my bigger, you know, 50 book bucks. And so I'm just going to show you some pictures and kind of point out some pluses and minuses, you know, why 9 points and 7 points. You know, a lot of times those, they gross well, but they don't net that well because they don't have symmetrical points on each side. So I'm going to show you that now, but yeah, I think that's what we'll do. Okay, I'm just going to skip around here on some of these pictures, and again, these deer are all up in a sporting goods store. More people get to enjoy them. Once you have them in your house for a while, you don't even pay attention to them. So I just put 8x10 pictures here, and they're hanging in a store for other people to get to enjoy. But anyway, the one we're looking at right now is just a typical 12-point. I shot him in Illinois on public land 2 days after their gun season ended. And that is really what you want to look for. I mean, he's got pretty decent brows. He's got pretty decent 2s, longer 3s, pretty decent 4s, and his G5s are not very long, 1.5 inches each probably, but it's pretty rare you see a typical 12, and that did not have much on the side of deductions. Now the one above it, that buck would have scored really high, probably would have been pushing 160, but if you look at it, you can see that the G4 on the right side is broke off. Right there. So he scores as a 9 point. So that big long G4 on the left beam facing us, that gets added on to your gross, but it gets totally deducted. So that buck net score wise is going to score like an 8 point. That 9th point on the left side doesn't even matter because there's no typical point on the opposite side that matches it. So you've got to have points that are symmetrical with each other on each side for the points to count. So that will score as, it scores as a 9 point on the gross side, but on the net side, it's basically that 9th point means nothing. And then, let's see. And go up here. Okay, that's just a really nice, relatively wide 10 point. Very, very symmetrical brows. G2s, 3s, and 4s were all about the same. Beams were about the same. But this next one's a really good example. That's a 22-inch inside spread buck. Shot that a couple years ago. And if you notice, look how short the tines are. That's very common with a really wide rack. You've got you know, the brows are really tall on that. I think they were 8.5, 9 inches each. But your G2s and G3s and G4s, I don't think any of them were over 6 inches. Looks like that G2 and G3 on the left beam, probably 4.5, 5 inches. Yet it has a 22-inch spread. Yeah, it's an impressive buck to look at, but I think that net scored like right around 130. Didn't score that high. And then you get up here. Now that's hard to tell, but it's got little kickers on each brow tine. So that's it's basically a typical 8-point frame with 2 little kickers, one on each brow, 1.5 inches each. You can't even see them because they're kind of pointing towards us. So that had about 3 inches of deductions, because those little kickers on those brows are solid deductions. They don't get added onto your net, or I mean onto your typical frame. They just get deducted off your total for net. And this one right here is kind of interesting. Now when I shot this buck here, so the first thing I noticed is how non-symmetrical the antlers are. The right side really dips down compared to the left side. But if you really look at it, the points are all the same. So just because it dips down, you know, it's not symmetrical in shape to the left beam. The left beam's more normal. It doesn't tip. The points are all the same. So there's no actual deductions there, you know. The beams are pretty close to the same. The G1, the brows and the G2s, 3s, and 4s were all very similar. So there was very minimal deductions on that, even though it's kitty-womped and it looks kind of crooked. Now this one down here, that's a typical 12. I'm sorry, it's a typical frame, so it went in a typical category. But if you notice on the right side, it's got a brow, it's got a G1, it's got a G2, 3, 4, and 5. Whereas on the left side, it's got a brow and a G1, 2, and 3. Or 2, 3, and 4, I'm sorry. So it's got, basically, it's a 6 points on the right side and 5 points as far as what you can physically see right there on the left side. Now there's another kicker on there, which is a deduction. But basically, if you look at that point correlates with that one correlates with that one, and then that one, as long as it correlates with this one. So you get a big deduction because this one's so much longer than that one. And then that one right there, it gets added onto your gross, but it gets deducted off for your net. So I think that scored just over 180 gross, and it netted right around 170. So that had 10 inches of deduction. That's quite a lot of deduction on a typical rack. Now the one above it, that's one of my favorite deer I've ever shot. That was on public land, 1983. And that's just the most massive buck I've ever seen as far as tines. I mean, the beams, the tines, everything on that thing was massive. And that, it's hard to tell, but that has a lot of deduction. Because if you look right here, you've got a brow tine. It's hard to see it. There's a brow tine back there, and then you've got a G2, G3, and a G4. So the right side is basically a 10-point frame, but on the left side you had a brow, and then you had a G2, and then you've got 2 points here with a common base. So anytime you have a common base, only one of them is going to count as your tine. So only one of those two, depending on how it is scored and how it looks on the beam, one of those 2 points right there is going to correlate with this G3 here. So that's a G3, but then the other one is going to be added onto your gross as an abnormal point, but it's going to be deducted off. So that's going to be a deduction. So not only are you going to lose the length of that in your net score, you're also going to lose this one, because this one has a G4. This right beam has a G4 on it. The left beam only has a G1, G2, and G3. That is not a G4, it's an abnormal point, so it doesn't have a G4 to correlate with this one. So that'll be deducted off in your net, as will that abnormal point be deducted off in your net. So while that's probably my most impressive buck, I think that's more impressive than this 180-inch gross buck. It did not score that well, but a lot of times score is not that big a deal. You know, to me, a rack being unique means a lot. Now that one right above it, again, that's a relatively wide rack. I think that was 20-inch inside spread, but look how short the tines are. You're looking at 4 or 5-inch tines. That buck barely scored 100 inches. It's got short brows, short G2s, short G3s, and then you also look, the main beams are relatively short. They don't come around at all. They basically come out and stop. The one on the right curls a little, the other one just came out and stopped. So it's got short main beams and short tines. That didn't score for squat. Impressive deer to look at, doesn't score well. That one scored very well. That's another December late season buck. Brow tines were relatively tall. G2s matched each other. G3s were the longest, which is rare. Usually your G2s are the longest. But it had decent 2s and then really long 3s and then decent G4s. So that scored very well. It was a typical 10. That one right there is very interesting. That was a very heavy palmated rack, very old deer. Shot that buck at noon. I'll never forget that one. Shot it straight up 12 o'clock on an all-day set. And it's a 14 point, so it's got 12 typical points, but it's got forked brows. If you can see, there's a big fork there, and there's a fork on this one right here off the bottom. It actually kicks off the bottom. And actually this one here, that longer piece, that's actually the abnormal point, because this back part of that brow matches the back side of that one. So this one here, you've got 12 typical points. It's got a lot of mass, so it's got a lot of circumference measurements. Beams were relatively long. Anytime you have a double-digit point deer, 10 point, 12 point, the beams are going to be longer because the beams have to be longer to add those additional points on it, typically. I mean, normally the beams are going to be relatively longer. You're going to get 20, 23, 24-inch beams, whereas with an 8-point, you know, beams are usually 19 to 22 inches. So 10 points are going to have a little bit longer beams. But that there, because it has those forked brows, those get added on in your gross, but they get deducted off in your net. So very impressive deer, and that scored well anyway. Even though it had like 10 inches of deductions, it still scored well over 150. Here's another 150-inch buck, and this was a 9-point. And something about 9 points. Anytime you got an 8-point frame here, you got 4 points, and you got 5 on this side. So that 9th point right there, it does not have a correlating point on this side over here, so that gets added onto your gross, deducted off your net. So basically when you score something like that, it scores as an 8-point. If you wanted to rough score that really fast, all you do is measure those 8 points in the beams and just pretend that 9th point wasn't even there, and you'd get close to your net score, because that 9 point doesn't even matter. The one below it, same deal. Awesome deer. I think that scored 156. The one above it was 156 also, or 155. This one's kind of interesting because this has a little unicorn. This was a typical 8-point frame, had really long bladed brows, had really long G2s and pretty decent G3s. But then right here, it's got this little, I think that was 7 inches or 6.5 inch. It's a unicorn. It actually, it had its own burr on it. It was connected to the bottom of the burr of the left beam, but it had its own little pedestal. So that is definitely an abnormal point. So that gets deducted right off your gross. So your net, that's almost a 7-inch deduction into your net score. And another 9-point, similar to that one a couple ago. So that's a 9-point, but that, unlike the other one, unlike that one where that 9th point gets added on and then taken off, anytime you got something like that, that 9th point, which is that little unicorn, that's an abnormal point. So that does not even get added into your typical gross. That's just a solid deduction. So if the typical part of that rack was, let's say, netted 160, and that's a solid 6-inch deduction, it'd be 154. I don't remember exactly what it was, but. And then down here, that's another example of a 9-point. It's got a perfect 8-point frame. G2 brows, G2s, G3s are relatively close. Looks like the G3 on the left side's a little longer than the G3, but that G4 on the left side, that gets added on and taken right off. So it's on a net score, which is something you have to do for book. That doesn't even exist. It doesn't even matter. Now that right there is about as perfect as you can get. That was a state record in Michigan for, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. And that's just that was off public land too. That was 167 gross and, I don't know, mid 160s net. I honestly don't even remember. But it was in the mid to upper 160s. And that's got everything. That's got beam length. It's got tall brows, tall G2s, tall G3s, tall G4s. That's just about as perfect a rack as you could ever want. And there's back when it was a state record with the other state records. Now that one there, it's hard to see from the glare, but as you can kind of tell, that's got forked brow tines. So that's a 10-point, basically an 8-point frame with forked brows, making it a 10. So those forks or abnormal points are solid deductions off that rack. Solid deductions. And then the one to the left right there, this one is really messed up. So this is a pretty good example. That's a 6-point. Now the right side does not have a brow tine, but it has what would be a G2 and a G3. The left side has a brow tine, but it only has a G2. So basically, because it does not have a corresponding brow tine, that brow tine is going to get totally deducted off of a net score. Also because it does not have a G3 on the left side, that G3 or G2, I guess it would be, on the right side is going to get totally deducted. So that's going to score as a 4-point basically, because the brow is going to get deducted off and that 2nd point on the right beam is going to get deducted off. So that's going to score as a 4-point with a G2 on each side. I've got a bunch more down here. Oh, let's see. I don't know if we looked at this one. I don't know if we did. that one is a very unique rack too. That's a really wide rack. That was almost 24-inch inside spread. But that's just a perfect 10. That had it all. Had tine height, tall brows, pretty long beams. See how wide the beams come out, and they come around in front a little bit. I think those were 24-inch beams. So that scored really well. But it's pretty rare to get a wide rack with tall brows and tall, you know, decent G2s and G3s. The G4s on that are pretty short, but the G2s and 3s are pretty long. And I've got a bunch more down there, but I think you get the point.
So when you're out hunting, you're sitting in a tree, got a buck coming in, look at the tines, look at the tine lengths. Don't look at just the rack height. A lot of times racks don't just come out nice and even like the ones I've shown on this video. Sometimes, once in a while, you'll have a rack that actually the main beams go up and curl out, and the tines are still short, so you're not going to get a big score. So you want to look at the tines more importantly than just, you know, the height of a rack off a deer's head, because that can be deceiving sometimes. Look at the tine height, and you know, you want your brows, your G2s, G3s to be tall. A lot of times on a 10-point you're going to have short G4s, that's pretty common, but as long as you got decent 2s and 3s and decent brows, you're going to be okay with your net score. Especially if you're looking for something that's going to net P and Y. A P and Y 125-inch buck on the typical side, or 150 on the non-typical, that's pretty healthy deer, especially out east. You know, it's not a big deal out west. There's lots of them. I'll see, you know, 10 to 12. I've seen as many as 18 in a 1-week hunt in Iowa and Kansas. But I haven't seen one here for 3 full seasons in Michigan. You know, look for symmetry. You know, if you're looking at deer and you notice the G2 on one side is a lot longer than the G2 on the other, or the G3 is longer than the other G3, or one brow's 6 and the other one's 2.5 or 3, you know, basically double the shortest point. That's the quickest way to ground, you know, to score a deer from the tree. If you've got a 10-point coming in, look at his shortest brow, double it. Look at his shortest G2, double it. Look at his shortest G3, double it. Look at his shortest G4, double it. Just guess what the length of the shortest one is and double it. Same with the main beams. Main beams, you pick the shortest. A lot of times one main beam coming in is going to be 2-3 inches short, obviously shorter than the other. You know, look at that, double what you've assumed that length is. Because basically you're deducting anything out of symmetry anyway. So if you got a 10-inch G2 and a 7-inch G2 on the other side, yeah, you get 17 inches on your gross, but you're going to end up 14 on your net. So basically take the shortest one and double it. As far as circumferences go, you know, if buck comes in and he's got some decent mass, he's probably going to be a total of 30 inches on circumference with both sides added together. If it's an 8-point, if it's a 10, it might be 32, 33 inches. If it's a standard, you know, just a standard mass buck, you're probably going to be someplace in the 25, 26 circumference inch total. So you got 26 there. You know, if you got 15-inch spread, that's you know, you're looking at about 40 there. If you got 10-inch G2s, that's 50, 60. You got 6-inch G3s, that's another 12. You got 72. If you got 5-inch brows, that's another 10 inches, that's 82. You got your spread, you know, whatever that's going to be. You know, it takes a lot to add up to 125 inches. 125-inch net typicals is a good deer. It's not as difficult for a 10, but when you go to an 8-point, a 125-inch 8-point's a big buck. 10 points, still it's a big buck, but you know, you get more beam length, and you got obviously G4s on the 10-point. So make sure you look for symmetry. Keep in mind width is one measurement. It's not that critical. And you want symmetry and tine height. That's where you're going to get your score. That's about all I got. So I'll do a little sign off, and that'll be it.
Always keep in mind, shoot a deer if it makes you feel good. Scoring's not that big a deal. It's something I've just chosen to do over the years, and been pretty successful at it. At least killing bucks that make the book. And always keep in mind, you know, a lot of times your wider racks, even though they look really more impressive, a lot of times they don't score as well because that width is one measurement, and typically wide racks have short tines. You look at something like this, it's got long beams, it comes around, and it's got tall tines. You know, each tine is a measurement. So you get 1, 2, 3, 4. So if this on a wide rack, if these are 7 inches and they're 10 inches or 11 inches on a tall rack, that's 3 or 4 more inches for each tine. That adds up fast. Typically brows are taller too, and a lot of times the beams are, because wide racks come out and stop. But anyway, I don't have anything non-typical to score, so I kind of feel bad about that, but they're pretty rare out in the field anyway. You see a lot of non-typicals in enclosures, and It's because they put so much minerals and nutrients in the food and in the food plots and stuff. And you see that a lot on a lot of micromanaged areas as well. You know, they're just pumping the stuff to them, basically. It's like pumping up a cow for the market. I consider a lot of managed properties and enclosures, you know, just like people raising cattle to sell for food. You know, it's just a marketing deal. I'm not a big APR guy. I don't like the federal government putting restrictions on me, and I think it would be hypocritical of me to want to put my restrictions on all the rest of the hunters that buy licenses. Not everybody gets the same opportunities as I do or you do. You know, a lot of people don't live in areas where there's deer. They live in inner cities. They work in crappy factories. I've done that. I worked in a lot of factories when I was younger, and it was very common for a 6-point or a small 80-inch, 2.5-year-old 8-point to win the buck pool. You know, they don't get the opportunity. They get a week off a year. And for them to go out and not be able to shoot a buck because there's APRs, because everybody wants to have lots of big bucks so that they can possibly kill one, I think that's pretty greedy, and I think it's pretty hypocritical, because you don't like restrictions coming from the federal government to take more of your taxes or whatever that may be, yet you want to put your priority restrictions on other hunters. So I am personally not an APR guy. I shoot big bucks because I'm at that skill set. A lot of people are not at that skill set, and they kill big bucks because they're hunting on managed property where there's lots of big bucks. They get lots and lots of opportunities because they don't have any competition. So I'm not an APR guy. But anyway, I kind of enjoyed doing this. I wished I had a non-typical buck that I could have scored, but I don't. And you know what? If you see a non-typical buck and he's got lots of junk all over his antlers, you're going to shoot him anyway. Don't worry about what he scores, because you're going to have a pretty high gross score no matter what if you got a lot of junk on a rack. But typically, if you got, you know, 2 or 3 abnormal points on a relatively small framed rack, it's going to definitely take away from its score. It's going to look cool. You know, a lot of times you can kill, you know, my brother, I remember he shot a buck that grossed in the 140s and it netted under 120. So, you know, when you get bucks that are out of symmetry, or they got some abnormal junk and it doesn't add up to enough to go into the non-typical category, you know, it hurts the net score. He didn't care. He could care less. But, you know, I scored it just for the shit, just for grins, and you know, even though it was well over 140 on the gross, it wouldn't have made P&Y on the net side. So anyway, hope this helped everybody out, and hope everybody has a successful season, and including myself, because I need one. But good luck out there. Thanks for watching another episode of Eberhart Outdoors, and please like and subscribe.